Okay, hello everyone. So now we're starting with the central nervous system. So CNS, central nervous system, and the two organs that are in the central nervous system are the brain and the spinal cord. So I'm going to talk about the brain over 2 lectures and then a third lecture with just the spinal cord. Okay, so let's look at the brain. Here's what the brain looks like. It weighs about 3.5 pounds, 1.5 kilograms, that's about 3.5 pounds. It's basically just a massive network of neurons communicating with each other and some supporting cells neuroglia around that. Even though it doesn't weigh that much, it has about 20% of the total blood flow. So that's just, that just reflects how metabolically active it is. So your brain is just constantly doing different processes and creating a lot of electrical signals, and therefore requires a very consistent supply of blood and nutrients and oxygen. Now, looking at the brain, you'll notice that it is very wrinkly. It's very highly folded. The elevations upward are called gyri if it's plural, or gyrus if it's singular, or gyrus. I kind of go back and forth how I pronounce that. So gyri or gyrus, or gyri or gyrus. So those are the elevations upward. Now the depressions, the shallow depressions between the gyri, those are called sulcus, or sulci if it's plural, or sulcus if it's singular. And the deeper ones, for example, the longitudinal fissure right here, those are called fissures. So the gyri are the elevations, the sulcus are the depressions between the gyri, and then the fissures are deeper grooves. There are 4 main brain regions. This lecture video is going to be talking about just the cerebrum, and all of this thing here, that's all the cerebrum. And then I will make a second lecture video talking about the rest of it. So in purple here, we have the diencephalon. Encephalon means head or brain. And this is the diencephalon. That includes the thalamus and the hypothalamus and the pituitary underneath that. Then we have the cerebellum. Now be careful, cerebellum is this, what looks to me like a ball of spaghetti. That's the cerebellum. The rest of it, this area here, that's the cerebrum. So sometimes students get cerebrum and cerebellum mixed up with each other. So be careful with that. And then in green here, we have the brainstem, and the brainstem has the pons, which is the first bump, and then medulla oblongata, which is the second bump. And then in yellow here, that would be the spinal cord. Let's look at the cerebrum. So most of the brain is the cerebrum. It takes about 80% of the total space. So usually when we think of brain, like when you have a visual image of brain in your mind, what you're really thinking about is the cerebrum. So most of the brain is going to be the cerebrum. And the cerebrum has 2 hemispheres, 2 sides to it, a right side and a left side. And a deep groove running down the middle of the 2 hemispheres is called the longitudinal fissure. Longitudinal means lengthwise. So it's the deep groove running lengthwise for the cerebrum. And that's going to divide the right and the left cerebral hemispheres. And then the cerebrum also has lobes. Now these lobes are going to reflect their regions. So you kind of think back to what the bones are called. So what was the name of that deep groove that separated the 2 cerebral hemispheres, running lengthwise down the middle? Starts with an L. Longitudinal fissure. Longitudinal fissure, right down the middle. Okay, so there's each the left and the right side. They are responsible for different types of functions in the brain. If you ever heard of left brain and right brain. One thing that I do find interesting is that each of those cerebral hemispheres sort of is in charge of the sensory and the motor, sensory input and motor output for the opposite side of the body. So for example, if you're looking at this brain here, we're looking at the bottom, the inferior aspect of the brain. And right here, this is called the optic chiasma, and what that is the optic nerve bringing sensory information from the eyes crosses over and goes to the opposite cerebral hemisphere, and the cross is called the optic chiasma. So right here in the middle would be the optic chiasma. In front of the cross, those are the optic nerves. Behind them will be the optic tracts, bringing the information to the cerebral hemisphere. So the information from this eyeball will cross over and go to the other side. And this is why if you have, for example, if you have a stroke, you'll notice that it only affects like half of the face, and it'll affect the opposite side of where the blockage actually happened. Okay, so that's because the information crosses over there. Okay, now on to the different lobes. There are 5 lobes. 4 of the 5 lobes are named by their regions. So if you know your bone, all those bones, you'll already be ready. Okay, so in the front means frontal. Back is the occipital. So frontal in the front, occipital in the back of the head. And then on the crown of the head, you have the 2 parietal lobes. And then this area right in here, kind of surrounding your ears, that would be the temporal lobes, like the temporal bone, the temporal lobes. And then the 5th one is called the insula, and it's called the insula because insula means island. And what it is it's right in between, or kind of deep to the frontal and the temporal lobe. So if you were to kind of pry them apart, it would be right in under there. So usually for models and pictures, you're not really going to see the insula because it would be deep to the frontal and the temporal lobes. So remembering back to the nervous system overview lecture, which part of the neuron was found in the gray matter of the brain? Okay, so your 2 choices are cell body, which is this region here, or axons. Which one has the gray matter? Cell bodies. Okay, so these cell bodies plus the dendrites coming off of them, the receiving areas here, those are going to be found in the gray matter. And remember that the gray matter is called gray matter just because of the color. It has a darker color. And for the brain, the gray matter is found in 2 places. The first is along the outside, just lining the very, very outer part of the brain. That's called the cortex. So remember, cortex means cortex means outer rind. So if you and it's a solid. Anytime you have an organ that's solid, the outside of that organ is called the cortex. So this is true for example, kidneys. So the word cortex is a broad term that just means the outside of a solid organ. So this outer part of gray matter, that makes up the cerebral cortex. And the other place that gray matter is found is in what are called nuclei, which are basically just floating areas of gray matter inside. Okay, so we're looking at the cerebral cortex. That's that outer part right there. That is important because that is where all of your conscious thoughts and perceptions occur. So anything that you are aware of, so sensory input that you have perception of, or conscious movements that you're going to move. So anytime you're moving skeletal muscles, those would all originate from the cerebral cortex. Okay, so again, that's just that outer part, right, that makes up the gray matter on the very outside. Now, before, at the very, very beginning, when I showed you the picture of the brain, we talked about the elevations and so the gyri and the sulcus and how they create an increase in surface area. Let's talk about that real quick for a second. You'll notice that the gray matter, so the cerebral cortex, is only found at the surface. And so the more folds that you create, the more gray matter you create. And so evolutionarily speaking, if you follow, if you look at the evolution of of different creatures, you might notice that humans, their brains aren't always bigger. What it really is they're more wrinkled. They're more wrinkly, right? So they have more surface area, because more surface area means more gray matter, which means more space, processing power for conscious thoughts and perceptions. So less just sort of instinctual behaviors. Okay, so cerebral cortex, conscious thought. Now, within the cerebral cortex, they found that there are particular regions of the cortex that are responsible for particular functions. And the way that they are able to do that initially is by looking at brain damage or brain disorders and looking at the pattern of symptoms. So for example, if you look at this picture right here, see this area right there? That area is called Broca's area. And what they notice is when people who have damage to this one particular spot in the Broca's area, they all have the same general types of symptoms. So they're able to understand thought. Some people are even able to write down thought, but they are physically unable to verbalize their thought. So that it affects specifically speech. So if everyone who has damage to that particular part, all are unable to, form words, then that area must be related to forming words, right? So initially they were able to map particular areas of the cortex that are responsible for different functions just simply by looking at what happens when it no longer functions. Then more recently, they're able to sort of fine-tune what they see using what are called functional MRIs, or functional magnetic resonance imaging. And what that does is it tracks blood flow. And the idea is if a neuron has an increase in blood flow, that must mean that it's more metabolically active, which means it must be functioning during that particular time. So they stick people in the functional MRI and they ask them to do a particular region, and then they just look at which areas of the brain are more active than other areas, and that helps them localize particular functions. So there's a lot of different regions that we could look at, but I only want to focus on two of them. The first one is the primary somatosensory cortex, and again, cortex because it is in that just the cortex, the outer rind of gray matter. And what this does is it is where all of the sensory information is that comes from your general senses. Okay, so let's look at this word somato. Somatic means body-wide, so general sensations. Basically, any kind of information that comes from your skin, you can think of it that way, goes to this particular region. So things like sense of touch, or pressure, or pain, or temperature, or all of those touch, all of that will come to the somatosensory cortex. And one thing that is pretty interesting to me is that the region within the somatosensory cortex devoted to that particular body part is not proportional to the size of that body part. So for example, the lips and the tongue and the fingertips, they have a much, much bigger area than, for example, the back of the leg, and it has to do with the density of the receptors. So areas that are very, very sensitive to touch and have a lot of receptors kind of packed in together, they're going to have bigger areas within the somatosensory cortex devoted to that particular part. Okay, so the somatosensory cortex is going to be located on what's called the post-central gyrus, post meaning behind, and the central gyrus is a medium groove. So what I mean by medium is it's not quite deep enough to be a fissure, so it's still kind of gyrus, but it is, if you look at this picture, it is deeper than other grooves kind of nearby it. So this groove right here is called the central groove, the central gyrus. And so behind it, so posterior to the central gyrus, that is where you're going to find the primary somatosensory cortex. Now, if you are behind it, which lobe would you be on? The parietal lobe. So the front would be the frontal lobe, so back here would be the parietal lobe there. Okay, and occipital all the way in the very back. Okay, so the primary somatosensory cortex is for somatic or body-wide general sensation. Oh, I just told you about this. Okay, and then in front of that, okay, so so right here, this would be the primary somatosensory cortex. In front of that, so on the other side of the central gyrus, on the precentral gyrus, which is this area in blue right here, you have the primary motor cortex. Now, based upon what you know about motor, like motor, the word motor in anatomy, what do you think it does? Okay, so remember, motor means, for example, we talked about motor neurons. Motor neurons take information away from the central nervous system and they cause other cells to do things. And so what primary motor cortex does, and remembering that the cortex is involved in voluntary thought, what the primary motor cortex does is it initiates movement of skeletal muscles, so movement of voluntary skeletal muscles. So if you look at this here, the primary motor cortex that's going to cause you to move, it'll be on the precentral gyrus. So this is what it is. This is where it's found, and it'll be on the frontal lobe. Okay, so if you look at it here, the precentral gyrus, anterior to it, that one is for moving. And the postcentral gyrus, that's the primary somatosensory cortex, that one is for feeling. So you move before you feel. Move before you feel. So those are the cortex. Remember, the cortex is made up of the outer rind of gray matter. Which part of a neuron has white matter, right? So if it's not the cell bodies, what's left is the axons. And remember that the cell bodies and the dendrites, those are for synapses, connections, so cell-to-cell communication, whereas axons are really for about moving the information on, so sending information to another place in the body, or another place in the brain. Okay, so it's what connects one region to another region. Okay, so there's several structures, but the only one that I want you to know about is called the corpus callosum. Corpus callosum, and what this is a white matter tract that connects the two cerebral hemispheres, right? So here you have the different cerebral hemispheres, and then running down the middle of it is a white matter tract. The name of that white matter tract is the corpus callosum. And so for lab, you're definitely going to need to be able to recognize this. If you look at a sagittal section, so along this plane right here, this big C, what thing that looks like a giant C right there, that is the corpus callosum. The corpus callosum is the big one here. And just so we are clear, the bottom one here would be the fornix. So you can learn that for lab. So the big one on top would be the corpus callosum, and that is a white matter tract that connects the two cerebral hemispheres together. Okay, so little mini quiz, let's see what we got. So if you had damage to the postcentral gyrus, post meaning behind this, behind the groove, the central gyrus, what type of symptoms would you experience? Okay, so would you have damages to respiratory rate, the voluntary motor control, or the sense of touch? Okay, so to answer this question, you're going to need to know which cortex part, which functional location is there. So the answer would be C, sense of touch. So on the postcentral gyrus, that is where the primary somatosensory cortex would be found. Okay, so remember, pre is primary motor, post is primary somatosensory. You move before you feel. Okay, that's all for now. Go ahead and move on to the next central nervous system lecture.